Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Rennemeyer. I'm the mayor of Windsor, Colorado. Police use of force, how police are trained, and how they are expected to adapt their policies have been in the national spotlight. Locally, our town board wants to work with our community and our police department and remain cognizant of what is happening in our world and in order to ensure that a similar strategy doesn't happen in Windsor. We want to acknowledge and address questions about the budgetary impacts of Senate Bill 20-217. We need to let our community know how our PD will address the use of force. As your mayor, I want to ensure you that the policies employed by our police department serve the dual purpose of protecting our officers and the public. In every measure signed into law, our police team will work to adapt and comply. And for the Windsor community, it's important that our police department continues to act upon the desire of building strong community relationships. In my time serving our community as a town board member and now as your mayor, I can attest that our police department is cognizant of our community's needs and that of the department. Under the guidance of our police chief, Clement, who continually works hard to recruit, hire, and retain the most qualified individuals. The department constantly assesses its policing policies, reviewing and improving them while conforming with industry best practices. As your mayor, I want our department to maintain its strong community presence. I also want our department to attract police officers who aim to make a difference each day. I want our department to also continue to interact with the public and continue to host local events such as our National Night Out, the Prescription Drug Take Back event, our Safe Halloween Trick or Treat, Bike Night, and many more activities. I, along with our town board, will work to ensure that the policies employed by the Windsor Police Department serve the dual purpose of protecting our officers and the public. While we cannot discuss what has happened in other jurisdictions, we are aware of these issues and certainly are working to ensure that a similar strategy never occurs in Windsor. The focus of tonight, though, however, is what's happening within our department. I want to thank you all for tuning in and signing on. I know there are many questions in our community regarding our police department, so I thank you in advance for joining us and being a part of this conversation. I want to remind everybody we only have about 45 minutes allotted for tonight's meeting, due to previously scheduled events. So with that, I will now turn it over to Windsor's Police Chief, Rick Clement.
Thank you, Mayor Rennemeyer, and thank you all for joining us today for this very important topic. Police use of force is on the minds of virtually the entire community and the nation as a whole. The tragic events that have happened in the state of Colorado and across the nation have brought to the forefront police use of force and how it's applied. I would like to assure the community that our use of force policies are as current as we can keep them. We deal with them on a regular basis and constantly are looking to make them relevant to modern standards and to meet community needs. With that, I'd like to have our moderator start our question panel.
Thank you all. My name is Jess Humphreys. I am the moderator for tonight. We will give those who join the meeting via Zoom to ask questions during the public participation part of the broadcast. If you are joining us on Zoom but do not intend to ask any questions tonight, it is helpful to know that you can also watch the meeting on WTV Cable Channel 8, on our town website, or on our town's YouTube page. Please know that everyone in the Zoom meeting will be muted until we're ready for the public engagement portion of the meeting. There is a list of questions that were collected by our residents prior to the meeting that I will address first, and once those are addressed, we open the meeting up to additional questions from the community. I also want to lay some ground rules for the meeting. During this virtual meeting, we ask that you please be patient and courteous. Please know that everyone will be muted until we're ready for the public engagement portion of the meeting. If you are on the Zoom, you may also notice the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can ask a question using this feature at any time during the meeting. The questions that were previously submitted were pre-submitted through a local resident, Jamie Hill, and I will address those first. When we open the meeting up to public comments, please listen for your name or phone number, and I will call out who is allowed to speak at that time. That's when we will unmute participants one at a time. Because we are using this digital format, submitting a question prior to the actual question and answer time is better to ensure we receive them and can address them. If you are joining us on Zoom but do not intend to ask questions tonight, you can again watch the meeting on WTV Cable Channel 8 or on our town website at windsorgov.com/meetings on demand or on the town's YouTube page. If you are having issues connecting via Zoom or have other questions about how to participate tonight, you can visit windsorgov.com/virtual meetings for more detailed instructions. This time, I will start with the pre-submitted questions, and we will go from there. The first question, and these are to Chief Clement. What are the current policies regarding the use of force?
Jess, let me first, I need to thank Jamie and Caitlin for being an integral part of this. I apologize for not mentioning you earlier, but this would not have happened without your efforts and participation, so thank you. The question referenced, what are our use of force policies? First of all, we use Lexapol, which is a nationally recognized company that deals with police policies and procedures across the country. They're based out of California. Our policies, procedures were last updated in January of 19, and we are currently looking at some additions to the policy. The passing of Senate Bill 217, which will probably go into law soon, will require us to make some additional policy changes to our use of force as we go through it. But the general concept of our use of force policy can really be summed up in part of our policy procedures. I'll just read the document to you. So the department recognizes and respects the value of all human life and dignity without prejudice to anyone, vesting officers with the authority to use reasonable force and to protect the public welfare requires monitoring evaluations and a careful balancing of all interests. Reasonableness is our primary focus when it comes to our use of force at any level, whether it's verbal commands to the most extreme. Fortunately, the Windsor Police Department has not had a regular occurrence of having excessive force complaints or use of excessive force. So it's never happened in my tenure. So, and that's been over 30 years.
Thank you, Chief. Next question. Do officers have a duty to report or intervene?
Yeah, there's two parts of this. One, the state of Colorado passed a law a number of years ago requiring officers to report any use of excessive force that they witness. In fact, if an officer fails to report that, they can be held criminally liable themselves. Our policy takes it one step further than that already, and it requires officers to intercede anytime that they witness another officer that is using excessive force or is out of control, and they are duty bound to make that distinction and step in.
Next question. How do current policies compare to the policies recommended by the 8 Can't Wait campaign?
Our policies, there's 8 campaign notes or focal points for the 8 Can't Wait project. We have 7 of those that are answered directly but in our use of force policy manual. One is answered basically in the concept of the totality of the circumstances, and that's the reasonableness use of force. I'll go through each of those points on the 8 Can't Wait. One, currently we ban chokeholds except for the option of deadly force is authorized. That policy is changing because of the Senate Bill 217, which is going to ban it completely. And so our policy will change to mirror that state requirement. The required de-escalation. We require training for de-escalation, and it's part of our ongoing practices from dealing with mental health issues all the way through. It's easier to take the use of force or take anything higher. It's too hard to take it lower. So we preach starting at the lowest level and working our way up to the most appropriate level. And again, that is part of our policy already. Requiring the warning shots, requiring warning before shooting. We do train that officers by policy are to announce verbal commands if it is reasonable and it's timely. There are circumstances that could be thought of that lead officer, the only use of force is to immediately take that deadly force, but they have to be able to justify that as the reasonableness of what force they're using. So it's always a reasonable standard that they're using, and we do train with that both in our firearms and our TASER program. The next one is the duty to intervene. We already discussed that the officers are required to intervene as part of our policy and the new state law. Ban shooting from vehicle or from moving vehicles or at moving vehicles. We do not allow officers to shoot from moving vehicles. We direct them to step out of the way of a vehicle rather than use deadly force unless they can justify why deadly force has to be used. So our primary is we direct officers to stay out of the way of an oncoming vehicle so that they're not forced in that position. A use of force continuum. This is the one that really is not directly in our policy. We have a use of force matrix that allows an officer to pick the appropriate tool when meeting any type of resistance. The use of force continuum is a concept that was fairly popular about 10 years ago and has been replaced with either use of force matrix or a paradigm of tools to use. We ask officers to use the most reasonable level of force when interacting with somebody on whether they can arrest or whatever the purpose is that they need to use what's reasonable, and it should not be greater than the force needed to take that person into custody.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, I apologize. There's one last. That's the required comprehensive reporting, and that is again is one of our policies in our use of force that we do require officers to submit the use of force form and to be specific in their reports as to what happened and why they had to do it.
Thank you. Next question. Please describe the process for receiving and handling complaints against officers.
If we're speaking of specifically use of force violations or complaints, they're the same as any other complaint. A complaint can be either made anonymously, verbally, over the phone, by email, or any other form. We take those complaints seriously. We prefer that people make those in person so we can get the pertinent information that is necessary to conduct an investigation. And then at that point, with the information we then assign it to whether it's a sergeant, a commander, or to do the investigation to determine if there is cause for discipline. If it does rise to the level of a disciplinary action, we have an entirely different policy for that process and how they go through that disciplinary policy.
Thank you. Next question. How many complaints have there been against the Windsor Police Department in the past 3 years? And does the Windsor Police Department publish this data anywhere?
I'll take that, answer the second part first. We currently do not publish that data. Any use of force as far as serious bodily injury or death will be required to be reported to the state under the Senate Bill 217. That stuff will be handled in that form. Over the past 3 years, we've only had one use of force incident where a person being taken into custody had injury to them, and that was a result of their resisting, and they had a broken bone. We've had far more officers that have been hurt while taking people into custody than have civilians or citizens being injured.
Thank you. Another question, two-parter.
Okay.
Does Windsor Police Department participate in
any anti-bias training? What and how often?
Anti-bias training is currently part of the post requirements for maintain our certifications. So we do that at least every, I think it's every 5 years it's mandated. We also do it at the onboarding of any new employee. And we currently have just completed that in March. And
how much of the policy and procedure information discussed this evening is readily available to the public, and where can we find it?
At this time, you would have to call the police department, make a request for that information. We hope to, in the near future, working with our comms department, have that entire policy posted online, minus any tactical policies for officer and civilian safety. But otherwise, the policy will be completely available.
Thank you. This is a little bit of a longer question. So, during the meeting we had leading up to this, you expressed that you agreed with the sentiment that we need greater funding for other social systems that your department interacts with. Could you share one example of where you would like to see systematic reform and how it would improve or reduce policing?
There are a number of areas that have been dumped into the law enforcement's plate in reference to social needs. Adult protective services are one, mental health is another. Those issues oftentimes get funneled to the police department because there's nobody else to call or can respond. Our resources are limited. We are not trained to deal with some of the problems that arise from these interactions, whether it's a mental health concern or not. We train with crisis intervention training to allow officers to some scenario-based training as how to deal with people from different backgrounds and positions, whether it's mental illness, whether it's PTSD, a variety of different scenarios that we train with that. However, that's training to deal with the interaction at the time, and it's a stopgap, and it puts a Band-Aid on the situation. We are able to hopefully come to a successful resolution, whether it's to find somebody to step in and help, but in most cases there's not the funding available for these organizations to carry out what they need. We are using our limited resources to deal with social issues that really should be handled by other departments in other areas. Mental health has overtaken many areas of law enforcement, and it's not a criminal act to be mentally ill, so it's difficult for a law enforcement officer to take that challenge on with the resources that we have.
Thank you, sir. Another two-parter. What is your opinion when it comes to mental health issues within our community and how we are currently handling these situations? Please explain how the current system for helping people with mental health issues is inadequate and how or why Windsor PD wants to see it improve.
Mental health has, as I said earlier, has really been a growing problem with our society, especially in Colorado. We've had a number of reasons for the increase in mental health problems, whether it be some of the drug laws that are in place. But for the most part, when people, a long time ago, we had an issue where we incarcerated people because they were mentally ill, and now we arrest people because they're mentally ill, oftentimes to avoid a conflict. They get into a disturbance where mental illness overrides what's taking place, and we are forced oftentimes to take them into custody for a criminal charge that really will be dismissed down the road, and isn't the option. You know, we will never be able to arrest our way out of a mental illness problem. You know, some of the jurisdictions are going to co-responders in cars, which helps. Windsor currently is in a position where we don't have the funding available to have co-responders with us on a regular basis. So we're put into a position where officers are asked to multitask and do things that they are really not trained to do. And so we'll oftentimes seek outside resources. We've had greedy co-responders respond over to assist us. But mental illness is something that will be a large issue for the entire state, entire nation for some time to come.
Thank you, sir. How does your police department handle working with other agencies, law enforcement, and child protective services? If a case has multiple jurisdictions, do you work with the others so that you can put together a case on a suspect?
There's many facets to that question. But the basic answer is yes, we work with other jurisdictions and other entities, depending on where they're located. Are they a local agency that we're dealing with? Is it an out-of-state agency? What type of crime is it? So it's a multifaceted, but the general concept is yes, we work with other agencies, whether it's assigned to them or assigned to us. So it depends on where the occurrence took place, where the primary investigation takes place.
Thank you. This is the last previously submitted question.
Okay.
Other cities have been removing SRO members from our schools. Has there been any talk of removing them from Weld RE4? If so, who do we talk to about this? Because that is not what is best for our children.
Very timely question. Just had a communication with the school district today that they are currently faced with some very trying budget issues, and so they were considering, backing off of one of the SROs because of funding. But they have committed to funding both our SROs for next year. So we look forward to that relationship with the schools. Both our current SROs have done a wonderful job in the schools and relating to the kids and bridging some gaps.
Thank you, sir. We do have one question that's been submitted through Q&A, and I'm going to start with that one, and then I will move on to the public participation, please. Before I do that, I just want to let you know that we've addressed all of our pre-submitted questions and we're ready to open the meeting up. For those of you who have tuned in via Zoom, if you haven't already, please begin typing questions into the chat feature through our Zoom meeting. Anyone who is waiting on the phone, when we begin taking questions, please listen for me to call your name or phone number. At that time, you will be unmuted and allowed to speak. To allow participation for as many residents as possible, we will limit questions to 3 minutes. This is similar to how we conduct the public portion of our regular town board meetings. before addressing staff, and this too is similar how we conduct public board meetings. Please state your first name and address. And with that, I'm going to start in our Q&A. Mr. Barry Wilson, I have allowed you to talk. If you could unmute yourself, and then I'm going to answer your question or ask your question. Are there examples when Windsor police may have been justified to use force, but were able to resolve the incident or issue without the use of force?
And I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I asked the question because, we don't have a newspaper anymore. And so being on the town board, we did get visibility to sometimes situations that could have been a lot worse without the patience and training of our police officers to handle it peacefully. And so I guess I'm just raising that, Chief Clement, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that to residents.
I can give you two very recent cases that involved disturbances or interactions where a weapon was pulled in one case on an officer and a female resident, and the officer used great restraint and removing himself from that situation, and they were able to negotiate with the person to surrender at one point. It took several hours to get it accomplished, but there was a handgun pointed at the officer, and he restrained from taking any other measures other than to remove himself from the situation to prevent a confrontation. Another situation involved a potentially suicidal person who wanted to commit suicide by cop. He had locked himself in the basement. We had family leave the home. When he wouldn't come out of the house to talk with the officers, they simply left him at home. He was by himself. He wasn't a danger to anybody else at that point, so they weren't going to force a confrontation. They didn't get down the road very far when he called and said he had turned himself in. When officers arrived back at the door, a safe distance away, he came to the door with a gun in his hand and brandished it before putting it to his own head. Officers again were restrained to the point where they held off and were able to convince a person to put the gun down. They were able to get him some help. They transferred him to the hospital. So those are just two of the most recent ones that I can think of. There are many other cases that have taken place. I stated earlier that we've had more officers hurt on the job dealing with people trying not to harm them, but have been hurt themselves in the process.
Thank you, sir. Barry?
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson? Okay. Next.
I'm just saying thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question submitted is by Grant and Erica. I'm going to allow you to talk. I will ask your question for you. Once I ask that, if you could just restate your name and an address, that would be wonderful. What if any, proactive steps is the town and/or Windsor PD taking to help promote anti-racism and build trust with POCs who might live in or want to visit Windsor? And an example is hosting or promoting community diversity trainings, participating as a department in social justice BLM events to show partnerships, speaking at schools on topics such as BLM, police brutality, and police integrity. Grant and Erica, if you could state your address for us real quick before I have Chief answer.
Yep, this is Erica. I live on Crabapple Drive.
Thank you. Chief?
Currently, we have no other programs listed. We engage in a number of police community events, from National Night Out to the Great Drug Take Back and any other events that take place. We're involved in any of the programs that we're asked to join. We do teach anti-bias in the department. We also have SROs at school who are engaged in this very topic in the classes there. So we do not have an active outcry for these types of events that you're speaking of, but we don't dissuade them, and we've had a very strong working relationship with the community for years, and really try to be responsive to the needs of the community. If this is something that becomes a wish and a desire, we'd be happy to be engaged with it and to assist in any areas that we can.
Thank you, sir. Next question submitted in the Q&A section of Zoom is by Laura Jackson. Laura, I'm going to allow you to talk. If you could unmute yourself. Again, I will ask your question, and then you can state your address, and we'll have Chief answer that. Does Windsor Police keep records or statistics on ethnicity/race of those questioned, arrested, stopped, etc.? If so, is this data publicly available, and where?
Laura, if you could state your address, please.
Hi, my address is on Whitney Court.
Thank you.
Or we do not currently keep that data. It will be part of the Senate Bill 217, which will be, depending on when the legal tells us to start keeping it, we'll begin with that. There was an initiative a number of years ago that resulted out of a case, I think in the metro area, where we had to hand out business cards and to everybody we contacted. And there was a script on the back of the card, basically how a person could go about filing a complaint or a compliment if they wished. Frankly, we had far more compliments than we had complaints. We took that verbiage off when it was no longer required for us, just as a space for officers to leave notes for people that they were giving cards to. I believe that will again be part of the new Senate bill, is that we'll have to start doing that again. So it'll be something we'll have to maintain. Where the records are kept will probably be at the PD, and they'll be publicly available.
Thank you, sir. This next question was actually submitted through this Zoom's chat feature, and it is by B. Thomas. B. Thomas, I'm going to click you to allow to talk. If you could unmute, I'll ask your question, and then we'll have your address and get an answer. For verbatim, my question has been answered, but concerned about interactions with vulnerable populations such as the elderly with dementia and folks on the autistic spectrum. Does training cover these types of interactions?
Yeah, we specifically have training directed at these populations specifically, and we bring in guest speakers that can address them as a whole. A few years ago, we had a gentleman lived in town who was a chronic walk-away. His wife did everything she could. Finally, she was hooked up. We were able to use some electronic devices and technology to put a tracker on him at her request, so that when he walked off, we were able to find him. That only lasted a short period of time, but we do have an interaction. That's part of our CIT training to deal with people that are unable to taking care of themselves, and specifically elderly. Just as a side note, one of our officers recently assisted a elderly couple who had been defrauded out of $92,000 of their funds. The suspect had been calling from out of state for about 2 weeks on twice a day, and the officer was able to recover over $60,000 for that couple, and we're able to get the department in Kansas to press charges against one person there.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. There is one more question submitted through the Q&A. Glenda Mills, I'll allow you to talk, ask your question, and then I'll have you state your address. What can we do to show the police department that we are behind them and help them through this very difficult time in policing? Glenda, if you could state your address, please.
Hi, my address is on Wind River in Peachview Estates.
Thank you. Chief?
It's very kind of Glenda to ask that question. I think open dialogue is currently the best way. This meeting tonight is an example of that very support and respect. Our department cannot be successful without the input of the community. This use of force is just one of the many issues that is constantly changing in not only law enforcement, but our lives as a whole. So it's the engagement of the people in the community that is most valued. We're not always going to see eye to eye. I mean, enforcing rules and ordinances and laws on people, sometimes there's one side that likes it, the other side that doesn't like it. And we understand it, but we strive to do it compassionately with respect to everybody we serve. And if we don't do that, I like to hear that, both good and bad, so that we can strive to be better in all our interactions. Our mission statement is a very simple mission statement that started a number of years ago, and it's to make a difference every day. And we ask that the officers, both men and women, that they strive to achieve that on a daily basis. So we're not perfect, but we do try to do our best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm seeing no more questions in the Q&A or the chat feature, so I'm going to start down the list of our attendees. If you hear your name, I've clicked the allow to talk, so please unmute yourself, state your address for me, and you will have 3 minutes to give your question. And I really beg for forgiveness on this one. Christy Malazowski, I hope that's correct. You have the floor.
You'll have to unmute yourself too. Christy? I'm going to wait just a moment and we'll come back to you. I'm going to ask the next person, Dayla Cook. You have the floor. Please go ahead and unmute. Okay, moving on. Elizabeth, do you have any questions? And please go ahead and unmute yourself. You have 3 minutes.
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say that I'm definitely on board with helping our police department become more aware in any area that people of color feel like they are not being treated fairly. But I also am in supportive of the police department because I've had a lot of good interactions, and my children also with the school resource officers. So it's both ways for me. I'm not anti-police by any means, but I'm definitely raising my voice up for the people of color so that they can feel comfortable in Windsor and feel like they belong. And that's not just a police matter, that's an entire Windsor matter. I think the police department is in the forefront because of, the media, and they are getting most of the attention, but it's an entire Windsor mindset that needs to be changed. So anything that the police department would be willing to do to bridge the gap between people of color and the white people, I think would be very well received. So, but thank you for your service. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next person, Jen Avalos.
You have the floor. Jen, if you do have a question, go ahead and unmute.
I think I unmuted, did I?
You're good now. Yes, ma'am.
I was more so just listening to the forum, wanted to cue in. We've been residents a long time. I just wanted to hear kind of what the support was going to be. And it sounds like those questions were answered. I think it's just more a public concern that we just all want to be aware of. I didn't really have any specific questions. It sounds like they were all answered.
Wonderful, Jen. Thank you so very much. Next person, Kelly Hancock.
You have the floor.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but I didn't have any specific questions. I was just joining to listen, so thank you.
You are welcome
for joining us. Next person, Ken Bennett. You have the floor.
Hello, everybody. I'm just listening into our constituents' questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for joining us. Chris Kazian, you have the floor. If you could unmute yourself and state your address.
Chris Kazian, Windsor Severance Fire Rescue Fire Chief, and also a resident on Reliance Court. Just listening into the work that the police chief and the officers of Windsor are doing and keeping current with the work. Thank you for all that, and appreciate taking the time to put this together.
Thank you for joining us, sir. Next person, Linda Johnson. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Hello?
Hello, we're there. Go right on ahead. You have 3 minutes. If you could state your address, please.
Okay, I live on a Conifer Court, and I know a family that is in a biracial mixed marriage. I have a grandson that I love dearly, and he is also. And I do feel that the Black community is discriminated against, and I hope this will change and everybody will open their eyes. Black lives do matter. And also, I think they need to follow up on the cops that have abuse in their background, and they should not be allowed to apply for another job in another city. What is Windsor going to do about that?
Linda, this is Chief Clement. Your question in reference to officer background stuff is again is part of the current Senate Bill 217, and it'll probably be also a national mandate that comes out from our federal government. We comply with all the laws currently, so as it proceeds, we'll match those. You're talking in much an HR question that doesn't allow us to share information at this time because of employee rights. So we do what we can within the current system we have, but this will be again part of the new Senate Bill 217 that is moving forward.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Linda. Miles Baker, you have the floor. If you could state your
address.
Yes, thank you. I live on Spanish Bay. Thank you for hosting this. I have no questions, just listening in.
Sir, for joining us. Last attendee, and then I do have one more submitted question in the question and answer. Paul Russell, you have the floor.
If you could state your address, please.
Hey everybody, can you hear me and my kids in the background?
We can hear you.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for putting this on. Really appreciate it. And Chief Clement, thanks for the heads up. I live on Summit Court, and I appreciate you making the time to talk about this. It's really an important topic, obviously, and I know you had your work cut out for you thinking about these things. Need some policing here in my house. You can hear upstairs. I've got a few questions that I want to bring up. You mentioned the complaint. Well, you mentioned the policies and procedures manual that hopefully you'll be making public soon. That's good news. Do you have a date for that? And then tied to that, you talked about complaints against officers. Do you know roughly what percentage of those complaints actually result in any sort of disciplinary action? And then my last question, I think is for you, Mayor Rennemeyer, which is, I think Chief Clement has done a great job being available for these conversations, being proactive in making statements about this. I've seen less from the town or from yourself. I know you're new to the job and all that, but I would love to hear your view, and I'd love to hear some stronger expression of solidarity for our Black community here in Windsor, small though it may be. So I just love to get your thoughts on this whole situation. And I don't think we need to put it all on the police to consider these issues and to fix it. So I'd like to hear your opinions on this. That's all I got.
Paul, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. What's the second part of your question for me? I got the first part. I was trying to write down something else and I sidetracked, so I apologize.
No, you're fine. I think the first part was
frame for releasing that policies and procedures manual. I'm asking that because I sent an open records request, and I'd love to not have to pay the fee for it if you're just going to release the manual. So that's a self. And the second question was, you receive complaints against officers. Kind of what percentage of those actually result in any disciplinary action?
First, I'll answer the first question. The timing is for that is really dependent on how we work with our communications department and getting it. They're inundated. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but they're a very small department and are tasked with a great number of needs. So as soon as my administrative commander is back from some family medical leave and stuff, he'll be tasked with making that as part of his objectives and we hope to have it done within the next few months. And I'd say in the next few months is I just need to give myself some leeway so I don't fail on that. The second part of reference to sustained complaints against officers. I've been here for over 35 years and honestly, without going back and digging out each year, I can't think of any sustained complaints that is good. We had, I'll give you an example. We've had, it's June now, and we've had one IA file that has been opened this year, and it had nothing to do with the public. It was an internal issue. So, so we normally don't have more than 2 or 3 internal or investigations on officer conduct a year. So we're very fortunate in that regard. Part of the new Senate Bill 217 will require us keeping those available and having track of those and posting. But I'll tell you, we don't have a history of that, and we don't want to start a history of that.
Mr. Russell, this is Paul Rennemeyer, Mayor of Windsor. Can you restate your question for me again?
Sure. It's not so much a question as just a request for comment. I just haven't heard your views on this. I haven't heard kind of a statement one way or the other about how important you feel this is, and I think this is a great chance for you to do that. So that's really the question.
Well, and I want to say that I find this highly important in our community, especially being 6-7 weeks now as the mayor, obviously stepping in the midst of COVID and then with the recent events that have led to our conversation today. Quite honestly, the reason I'm glad that this whole conversation has come up in the first place is because, me, like I'm sure a lot of my fellow town board members, haven't exactly been aware of what our town policy was regarding, matters of use of force and, training for our officers, obviously, so that they don't discriminate, etc. And so I have found it quite enlightening, obviously, to be participating today, but to hear the community conversation that's led up to our conversation today. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I find it very enlightening to hear the police chief talk about how our officers are trained and obviously what their book is on what they're supposed to do, allowed to do, and how they're held accountable for that. So I think that should make our whole community feel more comfortable, so that we all know the standard that we all expect in our community. So.
Thanks. If I could follow up real quick, what would you say to the members of our community who are Black or minorities who are dealing with the stress, or whether they have a strong opinion about this or not, are dealing with stress around these issues? What would you say to them, I guess?
I completely understand, and to the best of my ability, can see where they're coming from and the position that they're in. And I empathize on top of all of it and put myself in their position to the best that I can to go, and I guess this whole conversation has made me realize even more what they must feel and what they go through on a day-to-day basis. And obviously the whole national conversation that's ensued as a result of, actions in the last 2 or 3 weeks have obviously brought us all to that point where, we are put in that position of what our neighbors are going through that are in that minority. And as you said, Mr. Russell, obviously, I don't know what the numbers are as to how many people are in that minority in our community, but to the best of my ability, it makes us want to, love one another even more, through this whole process. So.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Last submitted question in the question and answer before we wrap up. What kinds of, and this is from Grant and Erica, if you'd like to unmute too, Erica. What kinds of conversations are taking place in Windsor PD related to George Floyd's death, recent protests, and the need for police reform? While maintaining confidentiality, can you give us an idea what these conversations sound like right now?
That entire criminal episode that took place in Minnesota is disheartening, and it's appalling to any good law enforcement officer. Never has it been trained to, in my tenure, to put your knee on somebody's neck in a prone position, especially if they're in handcuffs. The conversations at the PD, I don't want to speak for the officers there, other than to tell you that they are also appalled at those actions taken by those officers there. There's no place in law enforcement, and there's no place in humanity for that behavior. The unfortunate part is we're spinning sideways and losing context with a lot of what's going on. George Floyd was in fact a victim of a criminal act, and no different than somebody robbing a bank. The perpetrator needs to be punished, and I believe that the courts there will get the matter right. So I'll leave the judgment to them. As a police officer, we're tasked with enforcing the rules as far as arresting people and bringing charges. It's the court's job to pass that judgment. So our job really is to present the best case to the courts, and I'm certainly hoping that's what takes place this time.
Thank you, sir. That is all the questions that we have. I will throw this back to Mayor Runyemeyer for closing statements.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this afternoon's town hall meeting. And over the last few weeks, obviously, we've begun to settle into a new version of normal. It's not a version that any of us would have anticipated. We are separated from family, from friends. Some of us cannot go to work still. Several of us know people who have fallen ill with symptoms of COVID, and we know that those who have been confirmed with coronavirus as well. One thing remains, though, and that's we are all in this together. We're still Windsor strong. I look forward to our continued conversation as we go forward. Obviously, this is a tight-knit community, and I look forward to us continuing to be able to have discussions in the future that will, lead to us even being a more tight-knit community than we are now. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This really means a lot to me. I know to the rest of the town board, as well as to the other panelists that are here. I want to thank you for joining us and bringing this conversation before us today. It really means a lot. I'm glad that I could be a part of it. So With that, I want to thank you all, and I bid you a great afternoon. Thanks so much.